So now I would like to introduce Scott Greacen, the Executive Director of Friends of the Eel, and he is going to talk about pot and the effects that it's having on our salmon streams.
Thanks a lot, Lisa. And thanks you all for thinking about this. It's a tough subject. And 15 minutes is nowhere near enough, really, to address it. You're going to have to knock that back down. So what I want to do today is talk just a little bit about the kind of impacts we're concerned about for marijuana production in this region, and then explore briefly why, in my view, we have no real choice in this region except to move forward with a fundamentally new approach to marijuana, which is to say, to carefully regulate its cultivation, possession, and sales. That is, I think, our least bad option to reduce the social and environmental harms associated with what is clearly the North Coast's dominant economic activity. Now, I want to say this is a story shot through with contradictions, uncertainties, and above all, with unintended consequences. These unintended consequences are a red flag that we're dealing with what political scientists call a wicked problem, one that is not susceptible to simple solutions. Put simply, folks, there are no silver bullets. Everything we do is going to make something else worse. About these unintended consequences, the policymakers who prosecuted the war on drugs eradication strategies over the last 3 decades in this region didn't set out to create huge incentives to grow marijuana where helicopters couldn't spot it. Certainly, they didn't mean to drive the creation of an indoor marijuana industry that now uses so much of California's electrical power, it effectively cancels out all the efforts we've made to reduce climate change. But they did, and it does. Nor did the folks who fought to build a giant steel fence along our southern border with Mexico intend to give organized criminal networks a reason to shift some of their production from the Sierra Madres to the Sierra Nevadas and our own Klamath-Siskiyou and Coast Range. But they did. Nor did the drug warriors mean it literally when they promised to drive the growers into the wilderness, and yet that is what they have done. These gigantic trespass grows, often tens to hundreds of thousands of plants in a plantation, have erupted in wild country all over the state, on our public lands, on private timberlands and ranches alike, from our state parks to some of our most remote and intact habitats for species that have nowhere left to run. These trespass operations are routinely associated with a level of environmental impacts that can be staggering. It was the discovery by a determined biologist named Murad Gabriel and his team that the massive use of rodenticides in these trespass marijuana plantations had killed an astonishing number of imperiled Pacific fishers that really ignited long-simmering concerns about the environmental impacts of marijuana production. Can you guys hear me in the back? I'm not sure if this is working. Okay. Murad and his team have continued to document excessive fisher mortality caused by the use of these rat poisons in known fisher and known spotted owl habitat areas. These deaths are likely to lead to the long-delayed listing of the fisher, which is a member of the weasel family, about the size of a house cat, but with a tail that seems really extremely long, to the listing of the species under the Federal Endangered Species Act. Now, only this summer on a raid near Willow Creek, officers found hot dogs loaded with lethal carbamate pesticides hanging from treble fish hooks among the marijuana plants. They found a dead fisher on the ground. Thanks to Murad's efforts, an autopsy confirmed that he died of carbamate poisoning. What we don't know, what we can't know, is how many other creatures have died in similar fashion. We do know that the list includes at least hawks, owls, and bears. Just last week, or maybe it was the week before, the Humboldt County Sheriff and the State Department of Fish and Wildlife busted an operation with something like 24,000 plants in Benbow State Park and on the adjacent lands owned by the Barnum family timber interests, just off a key spawning and rearing ranch of Sproul Creek and the South Fork Eel River. The officers reported buckets of rodenticides and damaging stream diversions. Now, given the perilous state of coho salmon in California, the importance of Sproul Creek and the Benbow Reach to the larger population of coho in the South Fork Eel River, and given the importance of of that South Fork eel population of coho as an anchor for the species in California generally, and especially in view of the dangerously low flows in our creeks and rivers this summer after the driest January to June period in 90 years, those stream diversions are at least as great a threat to our heritage of salmon as those rodenticides are to fishers and other forest wildlife. Coho need cold, clean water. Like steelhead, they have to spend a year in fresh water before they can migrate to the ocean. They need flowing water for food. Both low flows and increased sediment make it harder for young coho to grow strong enough to enjoy good odds of return from the ocean. What the summer of 2013 showed us, in my view, is that for coho at least, we have already exceeded the carrying capacity of our watersheds to support both salmon and the level of human activity we're experiencing. If these impacts continue at the current rate, it is inevitable that coho will be uplisted from threatened to endangered. I'll see it done if nobody else will. We're already well on our way to undoing a lot of the restoration work that you've had described today that's been accomplished in the Eel River over the last 2 decades of toil. Now, as big and as important a part of the story of marijuana impacts the trespass grows are, they're just a piece of the story. Another, probably even more significant part is what some of us have taken to calling the green rush. The label deliberately evokes the frenzy and the watershed harms that accompanied the gold rush. And it's not entirely wrong to see some of the practices we're seeing as a kind of marijuana mining delivered, it's driven by the desire to make a lot of money and nothing else. We've got a vast gray zone in California. Since 1996, when Proposition 215 passed, growers are entitled to raise a defense that they're producing to meet a legitimate medical need. In the rest of the country, federal prohibition maintains a vast black market, enormous demand for the crop. And because of that, we've got people flocking here to grow marijuana. The Department of Fish and Wildlife's estimates suggest we've seen a steady, dramatic increase in the rate of production, in the number of grows, in the size of grows. We don't know what the impacts are that are associated with those, but we don't need the decimal points to know that the impacts are large enough to be significant and in some cases quite severe. In this region, we had at least 19 coho-bearing tributaries dried up by early August, and law enforcement continue to report busting operations diverting from creeks. In one case, longtime residents of the region were arrested for pumping dry the last pools in a reach of Atoll Canyon Creek to water 900 plants. In another, even more egregious instance, the site on Larrabee Creek where half a dozen folks with Eastern European names were arrested had a pipe carrying their waste directly into the stream. They'd been pumping the pools dry too, headed upstream. These are the cases we know about. We know there are many, many more. We can be equally certain that there are many people in the same area, indeed all over this county and all of our neighboring counties, who practice proudly a kind of marijuana cultivation that, if it isn't sustainable in the strictest possible sense of the word, can still lay claim to being about as ecologically friendly as any form of agriculture in the Western world. These are people who store winter rains for use in the summer, people who eschew industrial fertilizers because they're growing organically, often strains developed specifically for medical applications. These are people who bristle at the idea that they or anyone would use bioaccumulating rodenticides, let alone the pesticides that have come into wide use in indoor production and outdoor production to control pests like spider mites. They don't need chemical helpers because they don't grow in huge monoculture greenhouses. They may be outlaws, but they aren't the bad guys. They're generally as dismayed by the impacts the bad guys are creating and the fear they generate as any of us are here today. The question that faces us, though, is where does it leave us in terms of policy choices? I'd argue that at this point, the idea that we're ever going to be able to shut down a set of practices this pervasive, with this kind of history of thriving in these rugged mountains for decades under intensive law enforcement pressure is just not realistic. And I think the state of California has recognized that and has substantially defunded the campaign against marijuana production that for decades was characterized by the savvier species of grower as a governmental price support program. As I'm sure most of you know, the states of Colorado and Washington have passed initiatives that legalize the recreational use of marijuana. This August, the U.S. Attorney General announced a significant shift in federal policy in a guidance memo for U.S. attorneys who enforce federal law. What the Cole memo says, in essence, is that the Department of Justice will allow Colorado and Washington, and maybe other states, to move forward with effective decriminalization as long as those states implement a strong and effective regulatory and enforcement system that meets the department's standards. This means the states can start to serve as the laboratories of democracy on this issue. However, the failure of the California legislature to pass a bill that would provide for such a system of regulation and enforcement leaves this question, I think, very much in the laps of the counties. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing at the moment, because at this point, what we've seen from Sacramento are a series of systems that, like the Colorado framework, would drive a lot of production indoors and essentially regulate or attempt to regulate out of existence the kind of industry we've had in this region for decades. Now again, we've got significant effects. And I'm often hear from folks, well, why don't we just enforce existing environmental laws? And I think it's important to realize that the complexities around this industry mean that it's almost impossible to effectively enforce just the environmental laws. And indeed, what we see over and over again with law enforcement recognizing these environmental impacts and recognizing the need to act against the most environmentally damaging operations is that they go and they recognize those harms, they call them out, but what really brings the heat, what really gives them leverage is the criminal aspect of the marijuana production. Basically, they've got misdemeanors around their grading impacts and felonies for their plants. I think we need to switch that around. And the bottom line is we don't have anything like the kind of resources we need to do that kind of enforcement. The systems we have for regulating labor law, for protecting public health and safety, water quality, are designed for businesses and organizations that are basically trying to comply with the law, not people who are trying to evade the law. So what's a local regulatory framework look like in theory? I think we can easily see a system that would say to landowners, you have the right to grow on your land and to sell what you grow if you comply with reasonable limits on the scale of your production, if you use stored water, if you do not use unregulated substances, so no pesticides, if you follow basic best management practices on your land and your operations on your roads. In exchange, what the landowner gets is access to a market, a legal market, and what the rest of us get is both scaling back these impacts and a way to create a revenue stream sufficient to support the kind of enforcement we really need. Now here in Humboldt, the immediate challenge we face continues to be the lack of either popular or political will to move toward an effective system of marijuana regulation. To oversimplify, the folks who are doing it right don't see the use of new rules, and the folks who are causing the real problems have no interest in following any rules at all. We're only going to get a handle on these impacts when the community at large takes responsibility for the health of its watersheds, when the majority of growers who intend no harm come to realize that shielding the bad guys is threatening their own well-being. We need to move from a closed culture of secrecy to one of openness and accountability. But if we're going to ask people in the watersheds to set aside their fears and preconceptions about government, we need to ask no less of our institutions. It's extremely unfortunate that watershed groups in our region now have the impression that acknowledging the need to work with landowners who grow marijuana puts us outside the favored circle of IRWIMP funding. I hope I'm making it clear that it's really important that this group and these kinds of institutions address cultivation But it's also critical that we toss the obsolete frame of illegal cultivation. You have to understand that the citizens of the North Coast have already made this leap. In a lot of ways, law enforcement has too. The problem is not the weed. It's what happens when the weed is grown outside the law. Thank you.